Projectiles are fundamental to Terraria, and just about everything in Terraria spawns them. Mobs create them when they shoot, bows and guns fire them when you fire them, and minions create them when they are summoned. Every projectile has a peculiar behavior and is suited to how it works in-game. However, what happens when you screw with that? Using mods, you can change the projectile type summoned by any particular weapon, which leads to many interesting results. It can also serve to show us some of the weirder sides of Terraria. Let's go see some of that. First, we have to understand what goes on when we actually create a projectile. When a projectile firing weapon, say a wooden bow, creates a projectile, it doesn't actually do much. What it essentially does is creates a friendly wooden arrow or projectile ID 1, then gives it the correct damage value of 9, then gives it the correct velocity in the correct direction. That's all it does. The only things about the projectile determined by the weapon are the damage, velocity, type, and direction. Anything else that the projectile does after being fired, like homing direction, glow, and persistence, are all a result of the projectile's AI. For example, the way the arrow drops is not handled by the bow, but instead is a function of how the wooden arrow projectile type is coded. So if I make a flower of fire shoot wooden arrows, like this, the arrows are affected by gravity and fly in the same way as they would normally do, but they carry the damage and velocity of a normal fireball from the flower of fire. Okay, we got that, but there's a lot more to see too. The best interactions in here are created when we mix and match weapons that are vastly different. The flower of fire and wooden bow are actually pretty similar weapons. They fire a projectile forward at your enemy. It's pretty straightforward. So what happens when you try something that is coded completely differently? Let's start with a few things that you might not even see as weapons. For example, fishing rods. If you change any fishing rod to fire arrows, it will do just that, and rather quickly as well. The problem is that they don't actually do anything since fishing rods carry a base damage of -1, meaning that all the projectiles ignore enemies. However, if we give a rod a base damage stat, then bam, it can deal damage. As you see, the arrow is even rather quick because fishing rods fire out at a respectable speed. We can also experiment with projectiles that aren't traditionally weapons instead of weapons that aren't traditionally weapons. The powder from Purification powder is one example. It's not typically a weapon, but because it's still a projectile, we can set stuff to fire it. I set a magic missile to fire this weapon, and the projectile itself has some interesting characteristics. While the powder is fired at a respectable speed, the lingering properties of the projectile itself means that this mashup of a weapon can only fire at extremely close ranges. That being said, the powder will still linger at enemies, meaning it has similar damaging characteristics to something similar to like an Inferno Fork. Quite interesting. The most interesting weapons to mix and match though are minion summons. These are special because while minions are projectiles, their existence is persistent, meaning that when we change a projectile type, it gets real wonky. What minion staves really do is just summon the projectile, they don't do much else. So if we change a minion staff to summon a non-minion projectile, you don't actually get any minion. If I use the star to sell staff and send it to summon a wooden arrow or ID 1, it summons just that, a wooden arrow. This kind of lame behavior is true for most summons, but there are a few that act very differently. Any minion that summons multiple projectiles, like a Stardust Dragon, has many peculiarities when summoning like this. If I set a Stardust Dragon to spawn ID 1, it should spawn a wooden arrow, but instead spawns a wooden arrow, a flaming arrow, a shuriken, and an unholy arrow, which all quickly plummet to the ground. Well, why? Well, when you summon a Stardust Dragon, which is by default ID 625, it first summons the head. The code then adds 1 to summon the second segment, third segment, and fourth segment, so IDs 626, 627, and 628. When you change this ID to 1, it instead summons ID 1, a wooden arrow, then, like before, adds 1 a few times to summon the following 3 IDs. This is how we end up with those weird stats. This also works with any projectile. Also note how these projectiles immediately fall to the ground. This is because minion staves are not normal weapons, so they don't actually give them any initial velocity. All the minion moving around code is handled within the minion itself, of course, since it's persistent. Since all these arrows are affected by gravity, they simply just fall to the ground and disappear, which is what we observe. Other projectiles like yo-yos, tombstone, and cultist weapons also work exactly as they do normally, just summon at the cursor with no initial velocity, as you see here. Similarly, if you summon things that don't move naturally at all, like this fallen star, they just simply stay in place forever like this, since they never gain any velocity. This kind of projectile mashup is very fun to play around with. We're not done yet though. There is one other minion that has its own unique and strange properties and is worthy enough of a mention. The Finch Staff. Yes, the Finch Staff. For some reason, when you change a projectile on a Finch Staff, it doesn't just summon a projectile at your cursor. Instead, it also summons that projectile repeatedly at your head, where the Finch normally sits when it's idle. It's quite extraordinary, and I have no explanation for it. I've set it here to spawn Purification powder, and what that simply does is create a bunch of powder all around my head constantly. However, remember these projectiles it creates still have no velocity, so traditional stuff like bullets and stuff just fall to the ground or hover in the air. Quite lame. What happens though if we choose to summon a homing projectile that gives itself velocity? Introducing the Rainbow Rod, or ID-79. These projectiles fired by the in-game Rainbow Rod are known for their exceptional homing skills and make one of the best fits for our Finch-based weapon. Putting down any enemy on our screen leads this to seek out and destroy it with massive speed and piercing, though note that the Finch staff's damage is still quite sad. You can do this ultra projectile spamming with literally any projectile in the game, though you should note that if you use a projectile that persists and doesn't move, you will hit the projectile cap really quickly, and having 1,000 chlorophyte bullets down at the same time has the habit of, But anyway, that's only a few examples of what kind of interesting and peculiar stuff happens when you do this. I'm not here to make a projectile dictionary, and I highly encourage you to check this kind of stuff out. To find a list of every projectile in the game, simply go to this URL or search projectile IDs on the Terraria wiki. To find any projectile, simply hit Ctrl F and search that way. You can use any mod to change a weapon's projectile value, but the one I used is called DragonLens. You can change any weapon's values by using the item editor down here. Please note though that this mod has some bugs to iron out, like the toolbars not being swappable. Hopefully you can find some enjoyment playing around with this. It's an interesting side of Terraria after all, and I only covered a little bit of it, and it left out a lot for the sake of time. Try summoning some hostile projectiles, pets, minions, using non-minion weapons, anything you can think of. Have fun, and see you soon. Hello, if you enjoyed this video, I ask you to subscribe, as only 20% of you are. Here's 2 more similar videos on the nuances of Terraria on the left. Either way though, thank you for watching, and good day and goodbye.